Good evening. I'd like to call this meeting to order. Would you please stand for the Pledge of Allegiance? I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States. Mr. Fink, roll call, please.
Mr. Fry?
Here.
Mr. Harris?
Here.
Mr. Hunt? Mr. Moser? Mrs. Rance?
Yes, here.
Dr. Strasser?
Here.
Mrs. Waldron?
Here.
Dr. Weaver?
Here.
Mr. Hosterman?
Here.
Thank you.
Any comments from visitors this evening?
I have not received any.
Okay, Mr. Harris, Finance Committee.
I will pass it off to Mr. Fink for the 2024-2025 proposed preliminary budget presentation.
I believe Dwayne is going to have that up behind me here. So to start by saying a lot of this will be familiar to the board members who were present at the meeting we had a couple weeks ago regarding the first discussion of the preliminary budget. What I'll start with before going into the preliminary budget update is actually just a financial review of the 22-23 school year now that that audit process is wrapping up and we have the numbers to review. So starting on page 2, I'm going to cover the revenues. So bear with me. And if you have any questions, just jump right in and ask. But I'm going to run through it to give you guys an idea of what the year looked like. So total revenues, we came out in the positive. So we actually brought in 7.2% more overall revenues than budgeted, which equals out to about 2.7 million. To make up that total amount of revenues, we have it broken down to 3 different categories, which is local, state, and federal. The local revenues, which would be our local real estate tax, EIT, things that we handle here at the local board level. That came in $1.5 million above projected, and that was bolstered by our investment earnings in EIT. So this was the first year we saw interest rates really jump up. And with us making the budget a year in advance, we didn't project that high of an earnings increase on both those areas. So that was a big positive for us. State revenues, we brought in an additional 900,000 or 5.14% over the budgeted. That was bolstered by our PSERS reimbursement, our basic ed funding subsidy, and a larger than typical property tax reductions through our homestead, farmstead. Looking at the federal revenues, continuing a trend from the year before, we had brought in 12.27% more, 340,000 than budgeted. And that's because of the additional ARP funds. So there's additional COVID funding from the federal government that really was tough to predict because they sort of came through quickly. But when you look at the 21-22 revenues to the 22-23 revenues, we actually had a decrease in the total amount of money that was earned by the district. And that's attributable to the decrease in the federal funds. So while we still did get ARP funding, they were just much smaller than they were in the previous year as those funds started to kind of wrap up. Any questions on the revenues from last year? Okay. Hearing none, I'm going to move on to the expenditures on page 3. So same setup as the previous slide. Total expenditures, this side we want to be below. We want to come in less than what we budgeted. And overall, we came in 0.2% below our budgeted amount. So we actually spent $79,600 less than budgeted. Attributable to that is 4 categories that I broke it down for you. First one being instruction, which is our largest, and we came in 0.3% below budgeted there. Support services came in just a little bit over at 0.3% over. Extracurricular, so these would be athletics and any non-instructional student-oriented activities, came in at 11% less than budgeted. And then finally, our debt service came in a little bit higher than budgeted, but that was the year when we decided to take out the additional $10 million draw that we hadn't projected previously. That sort of came about quickly. So when you look at the final 22-23 overall performance of the budget, we actually had an excess of revenues over expenditures of 2.5 million. This is great news, really bolstered by our revenues becoming in much better, much stronger than expected. And us maintaining our expenditure line, being fiscally responsible with these amounts we set forth. And so that excess revenue goes into our fund balance and is something that we can then look at utilizing for capital projects or keeping forward to help carry us through any deficits that we may have this coming year and years in the future. So any questions on just the 22-23 expenditures? Okay. The next thing we're going to get into, I just mentioned fund balances. So I just want to take a second just to go over the most common fund balance types, and then we'll go into what our fund balance looks like now. And then the plan is to next committee meeting, have a discussion about what we want our fund balances to look like and what we're going to do with those funds. So the first is restricted. These are funds that are spent for a specific purpose. By far the most common would be setting aside for capital improvements. So this would be what I referenced at our last meeting. If we move money to this fund, it would only be able to be used for capital improvements if that's what we assigned it to. The only way that money is coming out is via check to pay for capital projects. So currently, we don't have any money restricted, but that is something that I would want to look at changing for us going forward. The second would be committed funds. These ones can only be used for a specific purpose, just like the restricted. However, they're not to the extent where that can't be changed. So it does take board action to commit funds. And once it's committed, it can only have its commitment changed by another board action. So if we decide to commit money to capital and then later said, no, we really need that for technology, then the board would have to take action to move those funds. Assigned funds, they reflect the intent for a specific use, but it doesn't require board action. So that could be a case where, we decide as a group that we want to assign $1 million to technology, but then throughout the year, if it's required to, we need to use it somewhere else. Dr. Bickhart would have the authority to be able to make that change for assigned funds. So more flexibility with assigned. And then I didn't list here unassigned funds, but unassigned funds are basically what's available to us essentially in our savings to use for the general fund. There's no assigned usage for it, but it is available for the school to use as they want. That's generally, we want to keep some liquid funds, but there are restrictions on how much assigned funds we can have. Has to be less than 8% of our total budget. So that's why it's important for us each year to go through and either commit or assign funds and not just leave them in a pool of unassigned money. So when you look at the page 5, that shows our current fund balances. So these were the ones that we chose last winter, and it's where our funds are sitting now. And you can see that the total unassigned is up over $6 million. That's more money than we should have sitting unassigned, and that's one of the reasons why we want to look at this for next meeting and decide how we're going to use those funds. I then project forward based on the balances that we have. So we ended June of 23 with 11.2 million. We're projecting the budget season, the end of this school year to have 8.9 in the budget. And so if, depending on what we do, deficit-wise or surplus-wise with this current budget, that'll impact what the fund balance will look like at the end of next budget season. Any questions on fund balances? Now we're going to go into the proposed preliminary budget. Like I mentioned, some of it's going to be very familiar to what we covered last time, but I do have a few new slides added in based on feedback that I got during the meeting. So first slide on page 7 is what is a proposed preliminary budget? So, why do we do this? What's the point of it? So it's an approximation to the greatest extent possible of our financial operations. Is to give us an idea of what our final budget may look like and to hopefully be able to present the numbers in a clear and understandable way for the community and our stakeholders. And it outlines our financial plans and projections for the future of the district. It is not in any means a final budget, nor is it an agreement to change any tax rate. So anything we advertise with the preliminary budget is not in any way set in stone. That vote doesn't occur for us typically until May or at the latest in June. So until that time, everything is eligible to change. We can change it all we want. The only thing we can't do is go above the Act 1 index rate for tax increases. Page 8 has the budget timeline. This is one that we've covered before, but now that we're moving along in the process, we'll just touch on the few things coming up here soon. So next week, we'll review the preliminary budget again, look at it, questions, but what we'd like to do then by next week is get the authorization to share with the public the full proposed preliminary budget, so that way they have a chance to review it, to look at it. When we post that, we post it on the website and in the district office. And then on the 12th of March is when we start our department presentations for their budgets. And so March 12th, we would hear from technology, cyber education, maintenance, and safe schools to give their report out. And usually included in that is also kind of a recap of how things looked previously and what they're expecting going forward. Any questions regarding the timeline or anything there? Okay. Page 9 is some of the highlighted expenditures. So these are just areas of the proposed preliminary budget that kind of stand out, that maybe are atypical, but have a fairly significant impact on the preliminary budget. So the first one is the debt service principal due. I mentioned last time that this is balancing out our new loans, our new bonds that we took out for the project at Bacher. Those principal amounts are coming due. It's not just interest only now for some of those. We added a community fundraising PR position that's new to the district that I've increased special education life skills as well as multiple handicap services and the elementary cyber costs. So those were all substantial increases over the previous or the current budget. We added professional department heads for the professional staff. We've increased the cost of technology, software, and hardware. We have a number of deferred maintenance and repair projects district-wide. And also we're looking at the regular education cyber charter costs increasing, and that's based on current enrollment and outside charter and where I expect the cost to be, but I'll have more on that later because we may be getting good news from the state on that. We added girls wrestling, which was a program we didn't have before, and then also included as part of the projects throughout the district would be the high school gym floor overhaul. And I know there's some other capital projects that we'll get into after this initial budget presentation. So any questions on expenditures, your impacts? Okay. The revenue side, the big one that's new for this year and something that's not been proposed since I've been here officially is the removal of the per capita tax. So just eliminating that, which does decrease our revenue, but it's a very small tax. It becomes cumbersome to collect. It's expensive to collect, and we don't make a lot of revenue from it. EIT is earned income tax. I increased that projection from the previous year based on how well we performed in 22-23 and how well we're performing now. State basic education funding, I have a big increase to that over where we were for the current year based on one, how much we received for 23-24, and also my anticipation for what we may receive next year. And the governor did have a presentation today to talk about the budget, so I'll cover those notes at the end of this presentation to give you guys an idea of what's coming out of the governor's office. Also increase the state special education funding because, again, same as the basic ed funding, it's being increased at historic levels. I don't expect that to change. And PSERS reimbursement, that increased significantly because also our salary side has increased significantly. So if our salaries go up, our PSERS costs go up, but it also means our reimbursements go up. So it kind of has to follow in tow. Page 11, continuing with the highlights, kind of summarizes where we stand expenditures and revenues currently. So current proposed preliminary budget has expenditures at $42.6 million, which is an increase of 5.2% from the 23-24 budget. Revenues are coming in at 39.8, which is an increase of 5.4% from the 23-24 budget. That gives us a preliminary deficit of 2.7 million, a projected fund balance to start the year at 8.9, and then if you subtract the deficit, it gives you the 6,234,598. But then you just add back in the $100,000 of budgetary reserve we included. So if we don't spend that, that money just gets added back to the bottom line. Any questions just on the very general high level summary there? Okay. Slide 12. This is the budget composition. Covered this before as well. Just a reminder that this just takes our entirety of the budget and shows you percentage-wise and total dollar amount where we're spending the most money and where our money's going. So it breaks it down such as salaries and wages, employee benefits, supplies, etc. So it's just it's a good way to look and see where the bulk of our money goes. And as is traditional every single year, about 70 to 75% of that typically goes to staff as salaries and benefits. So that's not going to change anytime soon. And it's just, it shows that that's where the biggest impact is on the budget. When we look at that slide specifically, Object 400s have increased by a significant amount, as well as the Object 600s. And so I wanted to touch on that with page 13. So the 400s, a large amount of deferred maintenance projects are included in this budget, and that approximate cost is coming out to near 800,000, which that number is kind of in flux. But that's causing the large increase from the prior year's budget. I have some of the projects that are included there, but I know Dr. Bickhart and Mr. Hoffman are going to go into that in more detail later, so I'm not going to do that here. And I did mention before, and we'll continue to talk about it, but I'd like to look at committing a portion of the fund balance to the capital projects and potentially pull those out of the general fund budget and have that being spent from the capital projects fund instead. Object 600s, the majority of this increase was within the technology budget. 368,000 were budgeted for device purchases. Were moved from the 700s, which is equipment, to 600s. It's really just for accounting purposes, but that's why you'll see the 700s decrease significantly and the 600s increase significantly. There wasn't that large of a change in that line item. It just happened to be shifted. So that explains why there was the jump there. Okay. So slide 14, that's multi-county tax equalization. I'm just going to really, really high level talk about this. But basically, because we have two counties that we collect local taxes from, Union and Northumberland, and their assessed values are so drastically different because of how long it's been since a full county reassessment, we are required to equalize between the two of them any growth in tax levy. So they're not going to have equal changes in the millage rate increase or decrease. What they're going to have equal changes in is how much they're responsible for the total levy. So if we're increasing the revenue from Northumberland by 5%, then we have to increase the revenue from Union by the exact same amount, also 5%. The reason why the millage rates can change, even though we're trying to equalize that, is because assessed values also change. So if their assessed values didn't change at all from one year to the next, then it would be equal millage percentage increases, but that's never going to happen. There's always going to be some differences between the two. And then also based on their fair market value, that impacts how much each county is responsible for. If anyone would like more information on tax equalization, I have an FAQ on the website. You go to budget, check it out. It's 5 pages. It's really well written. It's a great read. Feel free to check that out. If you have questions, you can feel free to email me or give me a call. But it gets a little complex when you try to break it down, especially just speaking about it. So if you have any questions, let me know. But bottom line is we have to be fair to each county, but it's hard to see where that fairness lies sometimes. The next slide, 15, is taxpayer impact for Northumberland County. So what I have in the first table would be maintaining the total tax levy from 23-24. So that would be carrying the same real estate tax plus per capita tax, since we're removing that. And what you'd see there is if we maintain from the previous year due to the change in assessed value, it would be a 2.1% millage increase, and that for the median home value taxpayer would result in about $14.66 more on their annual bill from what it is in this current year. If we were to go to the maximum possible tax increase that the district could levy, the median taxpayer in Northumberland County would pay $90.82 more on their total real estate bill for the year, which is a 7.46% millage increase. Next page covers the Union County impact. So same information, but just for Union County. To maintain from this current year to next year, it would be an $18.46 total annual increase to the median homestead value. And then for the max tax levy increase, it would be a change of $117 to the median homeowner's tax bill, and that would be 7.2% millage percentage increase. And if we were to go the max compared to what we have in the preliminary budget, which is maintaining, we would look at $672,500 in additional revenue. So, and that is on a scale, we can do tax increase or change anywhere in between. So you can look at various impacts to the revenue that we have. Slide 17, this is something I added from the last discussion. This is a historical real estate tax information. So I just took it back 5 years. But if you look at the 5-year average annual tax increase, Milton Area School District has increased annually 1.7% for Northumberland and 0.7% for Union. So that average annual tax increase in terms of dollars for the median taxpayer would be $22 Northumberland, $11 Union. And you can compare the average Act 1 index, so the max we could go to for that past 5 years has been 5%. But Milton Area School District has, in the past 5 years, gone much lower than that, not even hitting half of the average Act 1 tax increase. Any question on that slide? So the next one, this came about, there was a question about what the impact of the KOEZ, the Keystone Opportunity Zone, as well as the LRTA, would have once those expired and we started fully collecting on those assessed values. So the KOEZ, the end date for that is December 31st, 2028, and they will bring 934,662 assessed value back into our equation. So if you base that on today's millage rate, that's a today value of $68,941 per year that we would see back. Now, 2028 is 4 years away. If we have tax increases during that time, increase the millage rate, that money is greater. And then the LRTA in Union County, that currently has an assessed value reduction of $7.114 million. And with the millage rates of today, that's an additional $120,383 of tax levy that we'd be seeing. So all in all, a pretty safe bet that by the end of 2028, so the 2029 tax year, we'd be looking at almost $200,000 of additional tax revenue just from the expiration of those two programs. Page 19, this was one that I was asked to bring up. This is not currently in the preliminary budget, but it's up for discussion. I think it's been discussed before. But this would be the projected cost to provide full health benefits to all of our full-time staff. So currently, most of our special education paraprofessionals do not receive full health benefits. Same with our ESL aides and our regular education aide. So this table here shows how many of those employees we would have that would require the health insurance to be added. The annual cost increase, I averaged out what our annual cost as a district is for health insurance per employee, and then just multiplied it across. That brings the total number to 616,000. So if we were to offer full benefits to all of the projected positions that don't currently have it, we'd be looking at an increased annual cost of about 600,000 per year going forward. Any questions on that projection? Pretty straightforward, but I'm happy to answer any. And then finally, the last slide, these are just things that I think as a group, probably the big touchstones that we need to think about as we move forward into our next meetings and as we start to work towards the final budget. A big piece is always staffing. You know, it's 70% of our budget. It's going to be a huge discussion. And I know that that's something that we'll continue to talk about as the weeks and months go on as we finalize the budget. As I mentioned in the last slide, full benefits for all full-time employees. If that's something we move forward with, that's going to be quite a substantial impact to the budget, not just next year, but every year going forward. So big discussion there. The other big discussion we have every single year, obviously, is the how much we're going to change the millage rates by or what the tax levy is going to look like. So we'll continue to talk about that. Capital projects, another big area because we do have a lot that have piled up and we have the opportunity with our fund balance to address those. And then finally, fund balance, talk about that more next week and then hopefully look at assigning those fund balances at the February 20th meeting. But that's everything that I have regarding 2020 or 22-23 wrap up, as well as the proposed preliminary general fund budget for 24-25 as it stands right now. And then if you guys don't have any questions on that, I'll jump right in and just give you guys a quick overview of the governor's presentation today. That's all right. So the governor did his first budget address for 24-25 today, and he led off with public school funding. So I pulled out what I think are the key points there and what would impact public schools. So the first one and the biggest one is basic education funding. He is proposing an increase of nearly $1.1 billion for basic ed funding. So that's on top of the already big increase we received for this current year. Nearly 900 million of that is proposed as a first-year adequacy investment, and then 200 will be pushed through the basic ed funding formula. So what that means is our basic education funding from the state is broken into two parts. It's the part we're guaranteed to get that doesn't change. We get it every year, hasn't changed since 2015. And then we have the funding formula, which is trying to be equitable to districts that need more funding than others. And there's a lot of factors that go into it, but there's weighted factors such as ESL levels, poverty levels, a whole bunch goes into it. So when they say 900 million is just going to go in as a first year adequacy investment, that's pretty big. That means that the number we've had, that's our base starting point that hasn't changed for almost 10 years, is now going to get a huge lift and not change going forward. So it kind of locks that money in. When you run money through the formula, currently Milton gets about 112,000 for every 100 million. So if they talk about adding 200 million to the formula, you can expect us to get about 224,000 directly hitting our revenue side for the state funding. I did run some numbers based on these projections. And again, these are just what the governor is proposing. Far, far, far from having the actual budget passed. But you know, you're always glad to hear when the numbers are that high, because that's a hugely impactful amount of money. So for Milton, if that money came in as stated, our basic ed funding would go up to about 12.6 million compared to the 11 million that we have this year. So that's an increase of $1.5 million from this year to next year. I mean, that is massive. The current preliminary budget that I projected 11.5 million. So even if the funding doesn't quite come in as high, it's still what I'm projecting a higher amount. So I think we're in a good spot there. Special education funding, he mentioned an increase of $50 million for special ed funding. Not as big, but you know, any little bit helps. And it's certainly not small. I mean, historically, it's still a large increase for special ed funding. It's just not going to have that huge bottom line impact that the basic ed funding had. So the projection for Milton would be 1,831,942 based on that new amount, compared to 1.772 million that we received this year. So it'd be an increase of about $59,000. I've already projected about that much for next year. I was kind of expecting special ed to come in there. So on the proposed preliminary budget, I have a projection of 1,823,200. So pretty close to what we may be looking at if that doesn't change. The next thing that he talked about was instituting cyber charter reform. And this one was massive. He stated a flat tuition rate of $8,000 per student per year. They didn't go into detail if that's for special ed and regular students. So I'm going off the basis that it's students. They just said students. So to give you an idea, we pay $13,000 per year per regular ed student, and we pay $30,000 per year per special ed student. So we currently budget $1,087,000 for cyber charter costs. This proposed legislation could reduce our total cost by as much as $575,000. So just massive. And what makes it even better is you can actually budget it smartly. Right now, I have to create our costs. So until we actually pass a budget, I don't know how much we're going to have to pay the charter school, and it fluctuates every single year, which is absurd, because it means that a student who lives in Milton that attends the same cyber school that someone from Lewisburg does or Danville does has a different tuition rate for the same education that they're receiving. So having a flat rate across the state, it just, one, it makes a ton of sense, but two, it's just really, really beneficial for all public schools, and something I've been looking forward to for a while. Career and technical education, $2.4 million increase for CTE, and continuing $7 million in support of dual enrollment. He also announced school safety and security grants, continuing a $50 million annual investment in school safety and security improvements, and it provides $300 million in sustainable funding for environmental repair projects in school buildings. Mental health, he's committed to another $100 million to put more mental health resources in our schools. Student health was another area he covered, and that was $3 million to provide menstrual hygiene products at no cost to students in schools. So that would be for all students across PA. The school would not be charged anything to make sure that those supplies are available to our students who have need. Early childhood learning, they added an additional $17 million to receive high quality support and resources through early intervention. an additional 2.7 million in the Head Start Supplemental Assistance Program, and an additional 30 million for the Pre-K Counts Program. To help get more teachers for the state, he included an educator talent recruitment. So that's an additional $10 million for the educator talent recruitment account to increase participation in education workforce by covering tuition, fees, supplies, or other costs that serve as barriers. Student teacher stipends. So our student teachers are now able to receive a stipend so they can earn some money while they're student teaching. And that funding has increased by $5 million to a total of $15 million to support our Pennsylvanians who are training to become certified educators in the Commonwealth. One other area he touched on was continuing the universal free breakfast. And he made a call to raise minimum wage to $15 an hour. And that, in a nutshell, a lot to cover. That just covered the public ed side. There's also a lot more on state higher ed. But that's, I welcome you guys to check that out. But it was a pretty impactful presentation and a great start to the state budget year. Any questions? That's everything for me.
So I think to review, I think a couple critical points as we're moving forward from the leadership team for you. We've talked for years about the fiscal cliff. You've heard it prior to me coming here, the fiscal cliff was coming. What I'm very hopeful for and what you're seeing is the state recognizing they need to meet districts, especially a district like ours, at that level. So I feel like what Mr. Fink is describing to you is our ability, that concern we've had for years, and what are we going to be able to do? We could never raise taxes enough to cover a $2.7 million deficit. So I'm feeling more and more confident that aspect of where we have been for years and what is being met by the state level is going to hopefully balance us. Again, we can't promise anything. So that's that first. So when we reference the fact that staffing is such a huge piece of this, we have been, we've been doing it for weeks, for months, but specifically in light of our conversations on scheduling, the entire leadership team has been working at what does our staffing look like for the future? What do we want to do? I think two things that we projected last year was a 7-year plan, which we're going to come back to based off all of this, but a lot of that dealt with reduction in certain staffing. What I would want us to caution is the need to do that in light of what we are hearing. I don't think we want to be adding tons of things. So I want the board to know one of the things we are working on as a team, as we creatively look to come back to you next week, is how do we look at the current professional staff we have right now? How do we, even if people leave, resign, retire, reallocate? Okay, looking at that from again, what Mr. Fink has just described. So please know that is a major piece. Think reallocation rather than reduction based off of some of these factors we are hearing. Again, up for discussion as we move forward, but we think we're excited. We've come up with some creative means, I think, that we want to share with you here in the next few weeks about where we can take all 4 of our buildings. And I know I speak for the team in that we're excited. There's just been opportunities we haven't thought about, and I thank the board for asking questions because it's made us think a little bit different. While I feel very confident, and again, Derek would tell me, be cautious of where these funding sources are going. I believe in listening to a lot of you in your discussion on where we are. You see 2 things that he just described. We are recommending increasing, and we're recommending benefits. What I would ask you to truly consider in this, I know it's a full ask for complete adding, to the index for taxes, but it's almost apples to apples there on numbers. I think we feel confident in moving that forward as long as you feel confident in funding it. I would be cautious, being honest, be able to move $600 additional $1,000 if we weren't looking at that as part of our conversation with the tax increase. I know it's a lot. I continuously think about what we offer and what we do for our community when it comes to free breakfast, free lunch for our families that have students. So, as I look at Derek's last page there, I reference staffing, talking about the need for full benefits for all our employees. To me, that is just an ultimate sign of respect for some of our people who are really knee deep into some of the most difficult situations in our classrooms. which then I agree impacts taxes finally. And I'll have Mr. Harris, kind of read through this a little bit, but I'll give you each one of these. We were discussing the fact that our last facilities committee, when we look at our capital projects and what Mr. Fink is going to discuss next week about funds and where we go with those funds, these are what I would describe as opportunities. I'm not sure I have a ton for everybody. I have it for the board. And you can put it up. Mr. Kimberly is going to put it on the screen. What we did was, if you look at year one, next year, 24, 25, ultimately we took that and I just tiered it for you to think about it. If there were, opportunities to shift those things around, we can talk about that. Then I gave you the next couple of years. So I'll turn it over to you, Mr. Harris, to kind of talk through some of those options and we'll start there with our discussion.
All right. So we first identify what funding is actually allocated already for these.
Yeah. So you're talking the capital project?
Yep.
Yeah, so that, I'll find the page for you here, but it's under the maintenance budget. So if you go to, page number 9. If you go to the maintenance budget, which you'll see maintenance at the top, and then under 2620, which is operation of buildings, the object number is 430, and that's where these projects would currently be listed. So currently, that budget amount is 1.12 million. See, what page numbers?
So you said 1.12 million.
Yeah. So it's under the maintenance budget, 2620 operation of buildings. The object is 430, and currently budgeted there is $1,120,215. So that's an increase of 450,000 from our current budget. And briefly in the details that you have in the preliminary budget, it lists some of the projects and some of the things that we're looking at. But it's not all inclusive like the one that's projected and it's just been passed out to you guys.
Okay. Of the projects listed, are there any, Ms. Gerton, are there any that we have the potential for grant funding?
Yes, so we met this morning and the secure vestibules, which totaled, I think, around 130 something thousand, we believe could be placed in the competitive grant. We talked about White Deer doors and locks. We talked about potentially the fire alarm systems, although that might exceed our $450,000 cap for that competitive grant. I think there's one more. Oh, yes, Bach, it's not on this list, but Bach, Dave's new office, the doors and locks for that renovation, which is not part of the Bacher renovation project. So those are currently earmarked for the competitive grant. Additionally, I'm starting a working list in my office. There's some software that can be added into that grant, as long as previously we paid for the software out of a grant and it never fell within our general budget. So there's Vector Solutions, which is an online training platform that we use. Our universal screener for student behaviors called the BESS. Our employee assistance program, I just have to verify that never hit our general budget, that's been ESSER's paid. I intend to put that in that competitive grant. We have an upcoming school psych clinical internship, not next year, but the year after. I believe I could put the substitute teacher for that person in that grant. And there might be some money to continue to fund Officer Davis's SRO position. And that's in addition to $123,000 and change mental health grant, which I intend to write to continue to fund the guidance counselor position. And that would be next year and to December 31st, 2025 for that guidance counselor position. And the meritorious, the 35,000 meritorious, again, we could use that to fund the SRO position. So kind of playing with where everything's going to fall. So my intent is to leverage as much as I can of personnel and supplies and training that we already have in place that are still being used before adding anything.
So then I see for 2024, 2025, the tier 1 to tier 3 already have allocated funding, correct?
Correct.
So then that leaves for the 2024 to 2026, those are essentially focus areas that don't have funding that we would have to look at, correct?
Certainly. So the idea behind those additional things, it's been discussed for years, I'm sure, within the district, but just even as much as last summer, our team, went through that exercise. Mr. Hoffman has had a 5-year plan. What our goal here is just, I think last Thursday when we had our facilities meeting, we talked about a running list. Ultimately, in light of if we choose to move into that capital project fund where we are really considering every year a certain amount of money going in there, so we are prepared, it really puts us in a great position to be taking care of things. I think you've all stated about Bacher, just got to the point where we had to do it all. Versus when you see in 25, 26, there's a lot of things in the high school that while we could continue to ignore, if we get ahead of it with some of it, it might preserve what we could, instead of it being major project, major renovation. So they're very excited about this opportunity. I think this has been something Mr. Fink and I have talked about since I've arrived. This is a goal of mine to really be able to allocate funding annually to a capital projects fund and then have a wish list that we can go through and we can attack as a board.
If I can also add, we are anticipating the release sometime in February of information about another grant with a minimum of 500,000 to a maximum of 5 million. We would have a 25% local match, which Derek and the central office team have talked about. I believe you referenced it at environmental projects. So when you look at HVAC, when you look at any lead paint, asbestos that might still be in any of the buildings, once that information is released, we'll see how we can leverage that money as well. There is a grant or 6th grant that's also coming out that is up to, I believe, 10 million. Again, facilities projects. We don't have allowable expenses there, and I believe that one is a 50% match, local match, for anything that we would put in that grant. So we don't have the specifics about those grants yet, but this list can kind of guide that work moving forward.
The other thing I'd like to comment on about the grant that can go up to 5 million, the facilities committee members that will be there on this Thursday. Damian Spar, through Site Logic, will be present. One of the things, they have been heavily involved at state level with that. They have some insight, no cost to us. They're willing to discuss that with us on Thursday about where could they support us in, writing and moving that forward. So that will be a discussion on Thursday for those in the facilities. And then we'll go from there. If we can garner some of those wages or garner some of those funds, that'd be great.
And on the agenda for the full committee meeting, I'm going to give a brief of where we are thinking wise on what expenses are going to go into which grant. And we might have some additional information by then about those 2 other grants.
And I'll just add to circle back to the potential of moving it to a restricted fund balance. If we decide to move money to the restricted fund balance for capital projects, we don't have to name which project is used for, what's gonna be there. We can just move the money with the goal of that being to spend on capital projects, and then say that we come through with the grants and we only have to do 25% of it or 50% of it. That money's there, ready to go to do that right away. So it's really just a commitment on how much money the district's willing to commit to the capital projects. And then from there, we can decide which capital projects we're gonna do, hopefully get as much grant money as possible to help lessen. And then any money that we don't need gets to continue to earn a higher investment rate in that account. So just important to know that we don't have to wait for grant approval, things like that, to move the funds over, and to also pull some of these things out of the general fund budget.
So is there a thought process on how we would plan in place and how we would identify what other priorities for? Would that fall under facilities committee or staff? How would we approach that so we can keep on track?
Yeah, I mean, I think an honest answer to tier 1, tier 2, tier 3 would be, we have allocated funds for these. But again, just breaking them down in case we wanted to dissect them. As for 25, 26, I think it would start with what are the costs of each of these things? You know, and then reallocate based on what funding is there, how much we allocate for that budget season, and you know, what the board feels comfortable with. I would think that 25, 26 list there, some of that would have to move down a year. I don't think we would get it all done. Maybe we would. You never know. Just depends where the funds are. I wanted to give you priorities for next year, and then we can build from there on the future years. And please, if there are things you're thinking about, I'm sure some of the leadership team members are going, oh, what about this? What about this? We can continue to add. If there's things we went at it from Bachner's getting really fully renovated, doing some great work. Hopefully this summer on Whitedale we'll be in good shape. I know the team would be very excited to get some things in 25, 26 at the high school level. Exciting.
Anything else, unless anyone else has any comments about it?
I really talked about the auditorium needing lighting and.
Yeah, that's on here.
Is that on here?
Yeah, tier 2.
Tier 2,
Two,
pretty expensive.
right there it is.
Big number.
Is that something that can be done with energy savings project?
Yeah, that's exactly my next question. I thought,
That's a great question for Thursday morning.
It's a great question for Thursday morning.
they get they're all hyped on energy. Let's take advantage of it. I want to backtrack, but I have a question on the paraprofessionals. Misty, was it 16? Is that how many? The number of paraprofessionals
That we currently
currently have, or is that your hope to have?
No, that's what we currently have. I mean, we have budgeted, I think right now I'm budgeted for 21. I have 16. I'll be completely transparent with you. I had a girl apply last week. I called her. She wants benefits. End of discussion. Like,
That's my
Yes.
point. You can't say 16. You have to sort of build in there if you're going to hire 5 more people
Oh,
this year,
Right.
you know.
Yeah, so that is accounted. So on the slide that I had, like accounting for the benefits that go in there, we have 18 is the count of paraprofessionals we have right now. 2 of them already have benefits. They've been grandfathered
Right.
in.
Understand that.
16 need benefits, and then we're also looking at adding 7 additional paraprofessionals. So
It
that's
is in the budget.
yeah. So
I
it's
thought you
and
could-
yep. So it's in the budget to add the benefits there. Those additional 7 paraprofessionals, and I'm glad that you brought that up because I forgot to touch on it. They're going to need to be added to the preliminary budget as we move forward, because it wasn't a targeted awareness that I had creating what we have right now. So you're going to see that's going to come in, and so that's going to come in, and then as we move, what we do with the capital projects, things like that, we're going to see a pretty big shift in what the budget looks like. My hope is that when we finish up our discussions over the next two additional meetings, that I have a solid idea of if we want this added in, the benefits added into the preliminary budget, which I can always add it in and take it back out. It's not a problem. And if I'm going to be pulling out capital projects or some or none, and then come back with a clearer picture. And I know Dr. Bickard touched on staffing as well. We're still finalizing where some of those people are going to be. So it's going to move some numbers from one cost center to the other, and it's going to shuffle some things. But at least tonight we have a good starting point for what we're looking at.
And maybe we talked about this another time, but how many of the local schools do offer benefits for paraprofessionals?
I know Lewisburg
I was just
does.
gonna say the same thing. I know Lewisburg does. I'm not really sure that there's a ton more that do. Will say everybody that I talk to supervisory wise, everybody's looking for Paris. Like everybody's having the same issues we are in getting people.
Thank you.
Any other questions?
Talk about this.
Good point. So Mr. Husband is asking about the addition of the PR community resource position. We are currently working through capital campaign. If I say anything wrong, correct me. The group that's been meeting about the capital campaign, we're really looking to reestablish the Panther Foundation and use that as the stepping stone to everything we want to do. In light of that conversation and trying to reestablish that, we have begun conversation on what a job description would look like. That job description answering kind of a combination, a little bit to me, but a little bit to the foundation. We have a full board that would oversee that. We are looking at even a presentation to put together for all those individuals who are passionate about that to come to you and share that. Again, I think as you just described with the pairs, it's something we're going to keep in there as we go through this discussion. We will present in March at some point. We can add it to one of our meetings on that. And if you're confident or if there are more questions, we can have that conversation. I know there's gonna be a lot of opinion on it, but ultimately it's not just gonna be something that sits there and we don't come back to you with more additional information on. There will be job descriptions and points and key areas that we're gonna go over. Anything else I missed?
I'll just add that many remember when the foundation was established with Jeff Cow, Kathy Brodigan, that group of people. When the capital campaign came up, that group of people didn't necessarily want to be the boots on the ground asking for money. So that's when the committee came together with Dave Ettinger, Kurt Zedemoyer, myself, Sharon Admai, that group of people. Now that phase of
Don't forget Kevin Fry.
Kevin's, oh, sorry. I forgot several people. But that group of people was separate from the foundation originally. Now we're at a cross points where the momentum we found in that capital campaign is falling. People made pledges that aren't being fulfilled. Nobody's going back out to ask for money. We need to reestablish that momentum. So this position was really, it's been talked about for a long time. The vision, I think, of the foundation is to make it a tiered position where hopefully the district would fund it for 1 year, 50% the next year, then nothing the third year as maybe a model. To try to look at a model like Lewisburg Green Dragon Foundation where that person is finding revenue for the district full time. It's really what it is. But I feel truly to get it off the ground, we as a district need to support it and maybe fund it for a year.
I think the confidence of where to send that money fell through. I fell in
Because
the
there's been
category.
nobody full time.
Yeah,
doing it.
is someone there? Is the check gonna fall through a hole?
Hmm.
So I just thought, I'm just gonna sit on this till it's revived. So I'll raise my hand. I still several.
And that's what it is. It's
You
a,
know.
it's a lack of somebody making
Yeah.
it their,
Yeah.
their drive and mission. Now that phase of the campaign was over.
Darren takes the.
So, yeah, more info on that to come, but I wanted
Thank
to
you.
explain.
No,
it
I'm glad you did.
No, we just passed it.
I guess if you're looking at that sheet, I think to Mr. Fink's point, this is proposed, we're gonna make some shifts in this. An example is that high school gym overhaul, it's still on there. That was an initial piece, but if you go to the capital project list, that we bump back to 25, 26 in light of some other things. So again, just shows that fluctuation in what we're continuously looking at this.
Else?
I don't have anything budget wise, but just a procedural thing about if we approve department heads, how that's going to out. Are they going to be interviewed, appointed? Okay.
So as we move forward, been very clear that when we look at staffing, I'm working with my leadership team on adjusted roles and moving that forward. One of the things that Mr. Rance and I are working on right now is the lead piece that will be curriculum based. but it will also be building based. So for instance, we met this week, we're looking at what the job description would look like. What is that process for hiring? How many years will they be in that position? What is that exact stipend? What is the exact number? We have, if I was being honest, and we ballparked $1,000 per person, we have 23 right there. I think we were at 27. We were 25, but then Mrs. Gordon, you and I talked about the idea of nursing and guidance or something in that area of having leads. So again, I think that is without a doubt something as we present and we look at regular education and special education, our presentations, that would be connected to that. The board would have to approve a job description because we want to be very clear with people on what we expect from them if they were applying for. But yes, application process, I think you'd have a lot of departments, it would probably be only one person. They might talk about it and say, you get to do it. But if there were multiple, we would. Anything you want to add, Mr. Ants?
No, I think you and I talked, we're gonna work on the job. But hopeful that we March do something that have that done.
Does that mean that 23,000 here is
It
pretty?
might be 25, 27, depending. I think we have to, it's easy to really expand how many leads you want because you think of it from a building level, you think of curriculum level. So I think 25 is a fairly average number in there. But we'll see. We'll have that conversation. We'll also share with you what we think that the lineage is. So, where they are located and what their departments are. It's great questions.
Else?
Any specifics with the team here? Anything we want to get into when it comes to some of the line items or?
So on the 13th, we have a vote to post the preliminary budget review. It's a procedural vote, basically. It's not locking us into anything, as Mr. Fink said. So just be aware that vote's coming up.
The whole thought this year was to add these additional meetings to get together. So that way, as we go forward, we're all aware of what the budget. So the final budget's proposed, we're not in shock and after the fact of voting it. So this is our opportunity to have input, get aware of what's going on.
Anything additional this evening? Rickard?
Just again, any line items? I know we had this last week. Is there anything we can address? Come back with more information on?
And I'll just add that as we make the changes, the document you'll receive will get updated, but I'll have a bridge in there. So you'll be able to see where we started to where we got to. So that way it's easy to track what we're moving around. It doesn't get lost. So otherwise, if you guys think of anything, questions, things like that, let me know. And then
This budget, the preliminary budget, the same as what you gave us last week.
it just has I caught a couple typos, so like a few very tiny things, but it is very simple.
Okay.
Materially, it's the same.
Two more things before we adjourn. Next week, we're also voting on the school calendar, right, for next year. So take a look at that if you will, before next week. And also, we had briefly touched on making this a permanent spot for meeting locations due to audiovisual needs. We need to approve that and change the meetings next week for the rest of the year. However, I did make the executive session to make next week's meeting here. So the committee meeting for next week will be here, in this room. Okay? And then we'll vote for the rest of them.
You referenced the calendar. Please also, if you're talking to people, the calendar is posted on the website as a draft. Ask people for their feedback. My email's there. I haven't heard anything from anyone, but I'm open to any comments people have.
All right. That's for a motion to adjourn. Second?
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? We are adjourned.